welcome. Day 2 of the Ashland Independent Film Festival. Have you seen any good movies lately? Okay. Well, I'm very excited about this panel, and it means a lot to me that we have here our 2 winners this year of the Rogue Award, Alex Rivera and Cristina Ibarra. And that we've been able to put together this amazing panel to discuss the larger issues that are involved in their work. So let me just tell you a little bit about them. Alex made a film, actually has been working on media about the border and issues around that for quite a long time, had made a lot of short works, had a lot of new media works, and then about 10 years ago made a feature film called Sleep Dealer, which we're showing here in the next couple of days, which I highly recommend. It was actually the last film I showed at the Virginia Film Festival before I left there in 2008, the first film I showed at the Houston Cinema Arts Festival when I started there in 2009. An extraordinary work that's only become more relevant. It's an allegorical science fiction film, highly important, so please check that out. Cristina has been making works, also border-related issues, for many of them for PBS, including a work called Las Martas, which premiered on Independent Lens in 2014, and we'll be showing that as well as part of this tribute to both their works. Then, just a few months ago, their first collaborative work, The Infiltrators, premiered at Sundance in the next section. The next section is some of the most forward and thinking and advanced and adventurous works in the Sundance Film Festival. And they won the audience prize. And then they won the jury prize. Yeah. So I feel very lucky that I had extended this invitation to them before that, because they're in huge demand right now. So we also have on this panel Octavio Solis. Octavio has written over 25 plays, including his latest, Mother Road, commissioned by Oregon Shakespeare Festival. And this year, he came out with a book called Retablos, Stories of Life Lived Along the Border. And we'll be hearing about that. And then I roped in my friend, Peter Bratt, to be on this panel and to be the moderator. Now, a couple of years ago, Peter opened our film festival with the film Dolores and filled the audience. Last year, he helped us, and we brought Dolores Huerta back for an event at Kids Unlimited in Medford. For the Latino community in Medford, that was unforgettable, and I thank you for that as well, Peter. Peter had made several feature films, including Follow Me Home with Alfre Woodward, and an actor named Jesse Borrego, who is in the audience. Jesse is back there right now. Peter is partially responsible for Jesse being in the film Phoenix, Oregon, which we're giving our world premiere tomorrow night. So, Peter, take it away. Thank you for joining us, and we'll launch this TalkBack.
Does this one work?
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks, Rich. We also have in the house tonight the filmmaker Gary Lundgren, producer Luis Rodriguez. When Richard told me that he roped in Cristina and Alex for this festival, I said, "How the hell did you do that, man?" And if anybody knows anything about independent cinema, it's a coup when you not only win the audience award at Sundance, but when you take the jury prize. It's an astounding accomplishment, and so that Alex and Cristina, took the time to come here to our little town of Ashland. Octavio and I, we live here, so it's a 5-minute drive. So But they came from Los Angeles, and I'm really honored to be sitting here with you, Alex, and Cristina, and then my brother here, Octavio. This book is amazing. If you have a chance to check it out, it's really a great piece of work. You know, Alex and Cristina and I were talking this morning, and you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, not many people thought about the border. And when Octavio walked in, he said, "Did you see the headlines this morning?" And it seems like the headlines are changing every day, and there's probably not a person in the country today who doesn't have an opinion now about the border. And so we have a lot of different ideas about what that is. It is a man-made, it's a construct. Certainly the birds and the coyotes and the beans in the natural world, they don't recognize the border. So today we're going to talk about, I know a lot of you haven't seen the Infiltrators, Alex and Christina's film, which premieres tonight. So we're going to try to keep it general since you don't have a reference point. But I do want to begin this morning's discussion with a question that many audiences have for filmmakers, and it's a really basic one, and that is why tell a story, you know, with the border as a central organizing theme. Like, what drew you to this subject? And I know, Cristina, a lot of your work and yours, Alex, have dealt with the people and the crises and the life unfolding around the border on both sides.
Sure, yeah, I can start on this end. So, you know, I grew up along the border, and growing up there, you really start to feel that you really don't belong anywhere, right? It's this place where you see a lot of division and privilege and people who don't have any privilege. And so I guess for me, it really comes from thinking about the border comes from a really basic place, from deep inside, of wanting to feel like I'm visible, that I belong somewhere. So, you know, I was seeing television productions growing up from Mexico or from the United States. And on either side, I still didn't see myself. You know, I always would see people who were light-skinned, or people who just had different issues or different problems. And I started to question, you know, whether you question your self-confidence, and you really start to feel that your voice doesn't even matter. When I learned that you could actually make film and you could talk back to these big companies that were making television, it changed my whole world. And I was really angry. And so I started to make a lot of, you know, what you would call agitprop videos that were very argumentative. But then I started to find respect for the form and the narrative of it. And I started to try to learn the craft in a deeper way. So to me, the border now has become more of a muse, you know, where I think about it as a way of like visual language. You know, it's like, how can I show you what I see, but not make you feel bad about it, or, you know, just angry specifically, but more multidimensional emotion, and use it. You know, just think about language. Like, do I want to mix Spanish and English? Do I want to mix melodrama and you know, documentary? And so these questions started to become deeper, and they started to become more about the visual style. The border is just it's a more of a personal muse for me. But meeting Alex was really great because he also was thinking about the border, and I trust his political analysis, and so I'm gonna hand it over to talk to you about it.
Yeah, so sure. So like Cristina, my engagement with the Borderlands started from a personal place. My family is kind of partly a recently immigrated family, but I grew up far away from the U.S.-Mexico border. Was born in New York City. My folks lived in Queens. As an adult now, I can see Queens as a borderland, you know. And actually, most of this country is a borderland in a sense. The country is a place of contestation and encounter. Really at its best, you know, that's what the entire country is. And so when I became a filmmaker, started to want to be a filmmaker in my early 20s, I looked first at home. You know, it was the age, this is in the 1990s, the age of the personal documentary. And my first film was about my dad's life, immigrating from Peru to the United States. And to kind of, like Christina's saying, to make that visual, to tell that story, I turned to metaphor and I looked at two immigrants, my dad and the potato. The potato, of course, is of Inca origin. It was first cultivated by the Incas, and only through the conquest did it end up here in North America and became the French fry, the potato chip. And my dad became a kind of Peruvian couch potato, sitting on sitting on the American sofa and watching Univision. And so that first film was called Pa 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 Pa, and but from there it started this journey of kind of thinking about a third space, that my dad, sitting in the United States watching images of Latin America on the television, was almost in a sense returning home virtually, returning home through the membrane of the TV, through the membrane of the image, and inhabiting a third space. And so the Borderlands kind of metaphorically became a mental home for me and a place to describe my experience. And so then, over the years, started to spend time in the actual Borderlands. And I guess we could show this clip. Like when Cristina and I, we're a family now. We're a mom and a dad together. And but on one of our first dates, I took her to Tijuana. And we went on a shoot.
Sounds salty, but it's not.
It was a little salty. Anyways, we went on a shoot together, and wanted to share it both as an example of our early work. This is just 3 minutes long. We made this. It ultimately was part of a PBS series. It's just a few minutes, but this was filmed in, I want to say this is 1999. And so this is like a glimpse both of our own work way back in the day and of the border itself way back in the day. And so this is, again, like an archival glimpse. When we were there, in Tijuana, this is where the border wall rolls out into the Pacific Ocean. It's the western extremity of the U.S.-Mexico border. It was, to us, kind of nightmarish, this wall on a beach. So surreal, the feeling of the beach, which is of limitless freedom and relaxation and kind of peace, and for there to be a giant wall on the sand was absurd. Now looking at this video, to be honest, I was just there. This looks like the good old days at this particular beach, but let's watch it.
Yo vengo aquí cada domingo a encontrarme con mi esposo para que vea a su niña y pasar un rato agradable aquí. A veces traemos comida y nos ponemos, depende también cómo está el tiempo, traemos comida para invitarle a él y hacer como un día de campo, nada más que con un muro de separación.
A ver, vamos a probar. Sí, para eso no nos separa la inmigración, ¿de corazón? Muchas familias están separadas por estas barras.
Pues mi papá está ahí sentado, mi mamá está allá, mi hermanita. Vamos.
Es una alegría muy bonita y ya hoy, después de 10 años que nos encontramos, es una cosa muy bonita porque pues al acercarse nada más que tenemos de división unos muros, pero nos sentimos cerquita porque nos abrazamos y nos sentimos como que estuviéramos juntos.
Esto es materia, sólido, no lo podemos atravesar. Pero a su vez hay cosas que no son materia y sí pueden cruzar.
If folks, if you feel like taking a quick note on Field of Vision, there's a new short film that was released, I think, a year ago. I guess if it's easy, show a minute of it. But this is a new film that was, I think it was released last year, documenting the same phenomena of families that are divided by immigration policy, reuniting at the wall in that exact same site. But let's take a look at how it is now. So we did not make this film. We're showing it as a kind of reference for how the space has changed. But so now the families have to be chaperoned by border officials. There's two walls. They get let through a door in wall number 1 to approach wall number 2 to see their family members. And wall number 2 is now graded with this kind of like tennis racket type of mesh. So they can't even get a pinky finger through anymore.
Esa área, unos 10 minutos más o menos, para que miren mejor. Oh, sí. Pero sí, se lo voy a abrir, pero lo que pasa es que en los tubos, el más está en el lado norte de esos tubos. Sí, no, tienen que mantener esa distancia.
¿Y por qué no nos ves?
Sí, para que los miren mejor, ¿ok? Sí. Pero a ver por unos 10 minutos.
¡Bravo!
Les digo a los muchachos,
Yeah,
So they can see each other better. Wow.
again, so I guess if I can, maybe just a couple more quick comments. I mean, for me, when we were there in Tijuana shooting in 1999, that wall with this family holding the father reaching through the bars to hold his child, I never imagined it would get worse from there. You know, like to me, that was like maximum heartache and maximum surrealism, and it turned out, like I said, it was kind of the good old days. And so, regarding this, the topic of conversation today, up against the wall, I mean, I definitely personally feel up against the wall. Our work, the new film, The Infiltrators, the border wall itself is not there. It's set inside, in and around an immigration detention center. It's not really set on the physical borderline or deals with the wall, but the wall that I feel personally is just pressure to think past this stuff, to think of a different world, to use creativity and art to imagine a way out of this. Because it's absolutely possible that the film we just saw, the clip there, 20 years from now could be the good old days. That the world we're living today could be the good old days if we don't make a change. And the change is going to involve a lot of work and a lot of imagination, you know. And so that to me is up against the wall. It's like we need to make a change because this has been, the crisis we're living in now has been a long time coming, and there's no reason why it's not going to get worse unless we fight for it to change. You know, so anyways, I'll leave it there.
All right. I want to turn to you now, Octavio.
Oh, okay.
You know, as we know, you know, the border is an idea. It's a man-made idea. It's a construct that came, you know, I see it as part of the, you know, the colonial legacy. Mm-hmm. You know, indigenous communities throughout the Americas. There was, we didn't have those ideas, and that construct creates an us and a them. Something that Cristina was speaking about earlier, and I read your book, and I'd love you to share a piece, because one of the things I noticed in your book, hold on one sec here, is that your book captures the resilience of people living on both sides of the border, and I feel like you explore themes of human life that know no borders.
Right.
And I'd love to share a little bit of that, you know, with us today.
Sure, absolutely. That resilience is also a synonym of that. The way I think of it is stubbornness. You draw a line, we'll cross it. We'll find a way across. When we were kids, when my family used to take us all to Juarez to do our grocery shopping, to fill prescriptions. That's where we got our haircuts. I wrote about that. It's where we tanked up the car. And people from Juarez always came to El Paso to do their shopping. I had a cousin who came every summer, so he would come to El Paso and buy the latest Beatles album. He was a huge Beatles fan. and he came for that. It mattered it matters a great deal to people to be able to have that kind of fluidity. Humans are migratory creatures, just like other animals. You can't keep them in one place, and I found that I found that very, very poignant. Those very poignant stories, and but they're also my stories. It's part of my upbringing. So I'm going to read one of the pieces, please, if you don't mind. It's called La Migra, and it's from my book Retablos. That's what we call them. That's how I have always known them. La Migra is a derogatory term, but we don't even think of it like that. It's just what they are. Ever since we moved into the lower valley, the green and white cruisers of the Border Patrol have been everyday fixtures in our lives. In the early days, they are older guys who take their jobs in stride. They ride in patrol like hired cowboys, roping in the errant dogies, or maybe more like Texas Rangers, patrolling the wild frontier. They know a large portion of their migrants will slip through their net, and they know many of those they catch will be back through the fence in a matter of days. They're philosophical about their mission. What's the harm in a few mojados coming through? Don't we need the manpower anyway? Then, in the late 60s and early 70s, there's a new breed of officer. Stern, all-American types. Ex-soldiers who got their asses kicked in the jungles of Vietnam and now look to settle that score with these wetbacks and their smuggled Mary Jane. They take the job seriously, consider themselves a cut above the average city cop. What they do is harder and makes a bigger difference in the complicated world of La Frontera. That's my take on them anyway. I start noticing something else in the early 70s. Maybe it was always there and I just didn't see it. Or maybe it's a result of the recession and the lack of good-paying jobs. Suddenly there are more Chicanos manning the vans and cruisers. The iron in the faces, the edge in the eyes, it's all the same. Only now the faces and eyes are brown. The badges say Marquez, Armendares, Luján. Some are even rougher than their Anglo counterparts. It doesn't matter that their parents probably came over the same river with the same intention. One generation is all it takes to keep the past and the legacy of their migration at bay. They're American now, and this is how they show it. We're used to them, how they slow down whenever we're outside drinking Cokes by our bikes. The officer in his aviator sunglasses looks us over, scouring our skinny bodies for the one thing that marks us as foreign. Kino and I point to each other and mouth the words, "Take him, take him." My sister takes exception, though. She thinks the border cop is checking her out, and she's probably right. But the fact that he's even scrutinizing us this closely is disturbing. His look lingers just long enough to make us feel like strangers to ourselves. All the mojaditos that we generally scowl at when we spy them tramping restlessly past our house. He's consciously connecting them to us. We're nothing like them, we've conditioned ourselves to say. We're legal, born on this side. But the border cop with his steady gaze is telling us with his look that the distinction is very thin. Thin as the lenses on his aviators. Thin as a line on a map. This day, I am waiting for the bus to take me downtown to see a movie. The bus stop is just across the street from my house. The Border Patrol comes up the street and stops right at the curb. It's that Mexican officer again, and he's wearing the same reflective shades. His partner is this white guy who looks like he's been badly sunburned. Both of them are giving me a once-over that makes me nervous. It's the Mexican who talks to me. You seen anyone go by here lately? No. Anyone wearing a red tee? No. You're wearing a red tee. I look down at myself and look at the red t-shirt with the lettering of some band I used to think was bitchin'. Where you from, kid? He asks. Here? Where? America? Where do you live? Right there. I point at my house. What's the address? I recite it for him like my life depends on it. Then he does something unexpected. He removes his shades and asks me, ¿Hablas español? Now I'm trapped. I want to say no, even if it's a lie, because to admit that I speak Spanish would put me in the other guy's red tee. Just like that, he's made me ashamed of my original tongue, forced me to deny my father's language, and thereby deny my father and his fathers before him. And the crazy thing about it is this man is using that very same Spanish against me. There's only one thing I can say. A little. ¿Quieres pasar tus días allí? What? You know what I said. No, sir. He smirks at my lie and looks me right in the face. You want to spend your days over there? I'm an American, sir. Barely. Where are you going? The movies. In my peripheral vision, I sense my mom at the front door, and the white officer nudges his partner, who puts on his aviators and tells me to keep an eye out for a mojado with a red t-shirt, which is what I see reflected in the lenses. If you spot him, call us, okay? These guys are the butts of our jokes. Now they have me shaking all over. They say, have a good day, and drive on down the street. The bus comes right after they leave, and I go to my James Bond double bill at the Palace Theater downtown. And the whole time I'm watching the screen, I am hating these men and thanking them at the same time. Because they're right. I am the guy in the red tee. I am him. And he is me.
That's great stuff, man. That's a movie, dude. I want to make a reference. I know you haven't seen the film Infiltrators, but one of the things that struck me, and I find it in all of your works, your plays, Octavio, your prose, your poetry, and your earlier films, and that is, in Infiltrators, there's a reference to how the detention centers eventually shut down. And you make the point that the detention guards, they didn't know how to. They were trained to deal with people who were afraid. And once you get rid of the fear, they don't know what to do. And then as we see a lot of dreamers today, they wear a T-shirt that says "undocumented and unafraid." And it reminds me of the struggle that Dolores and Cesar faced, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when farm workers were being treated like slaves and lived in fear of growers, of deportation, and they would spray pesticides on them, and their children would be born with birth defects, and they had no voice. And Cesar and Dolores, their first realization is that, wow, every single human has power, and it's in your physical being. And once the farm workers learned that, it changed the game, and the growers they didn't know how to deal with that. I'd love you to speak about, as an artist, as a Latino, as an activist, and you also, Octavio and Cristina, about this idea of transforming fear and as a form of strategy, not just in activism, but even how you structure and tell story.
I think you should start.
Well, thank you for that frame. And it all sounds deeply true, that in order to transform a political situation, the people who are suffering it have to realize their own agency, realize their own power, and lead. And so our film, The Infiltrators, it tells a true story that happened about 7-8 years ago, when undocumented youth, folks that are sometimes called dreamers, right, reached a kind of breaking point. And there was roughly 2 million, depends on how you quantify, but roughly 2 million dreamers in this country. Out of that, let's say several thousand turned to activism, and out of that, only a few hundred turned to radical action, getting themselves arrested, doing civil disobedience, and basically creating a crisis for the political system at that moment, which was under Obama. And under Obama, lots of dreamers were getting deported, as well as many, many immigrants broadly. And but the small cadre of undocumented youth said, "We're done. It's like we can't get a job, we can't feel safe, we can't live this way, and so we have to make a change." And they decided to sit in, and it started in Arizona, in Senator McCain's office. 4 undocumented youth sat there and waited to be arrested and faced their deportation. And as far as I know, in world history, that was the first time that it happened. There's undocumented folks around the planet, but in terms of undocumented people saying we're going to reach that kind of breaking point, we're going to get arrested, turn ourselves over, deport us if you want, but we want to change. That happened in 2010, and that was sort of that's the beginning of the movement that is depicted in our film, and I think was crucial, and is something that we need to kind of think about today. Is like where the spaces that we build, the cultural spaces, whether festivals, media systems, wherever we're talking about this immigration crisis, the undocumented voice being present, because like the way that farm workers had to fight for themselves, or freedom riders had to fight for themselves, that Rosa Parks had to sit, herself. Undocumented folks themselves took this leadership role in fighting for DACA to get passed under the Obama administration. And so, anyways, I guess it's just that to us, both in terms of making the film and rolling it out, we view ourselves as kind of translators, amplifiers, synthesizers of an imaginary that was developed in that community at that time. And
well, what if I may say this, just quickly interject, what you're also doing, and this is the beauty of language, is with a documentary, you're taking the undocumented and making them documented.
That's good. Thank you for that.
Too deep.
That's a poet for you. Very beautiful sentiment. But speaking of fear, and you were asking about fear in a few different ways, and so we see how when we met the Infiltrators, we saw how with their position, they were still able to create change, and they were teaching us that we could do it from a different place. And so of course, they're putting their bodies on the line and they're risking, their own home by doing it. But by doing that, it also inspires you from your own comfortable place to also say something which maybe you wouldn't have before. And the way that we took that inspiration as filmmakers is through language, And so we thought we're going to take their lead, right? So they are taking on these roles. You'll have to see the film to really understand, but they're taking on these roles and they're performing. You call them it's political theater almost, as you described it, that they are engaging with in order to do their deportation defense work. And so how can we as filmmakers do that? And so the way we did is we decided, well, we're going to try to be as risky as we can with form itself and language and try to mix things up. We're going to follow them when we can, and then when we can't, then we're going to turn to actors and performers just the way that they did. They used their bodies, they performed, and so it's just like taking their lead was really important in telling the story.
Yeah, I found all the films really, really powerful, and the Infiltrators is unique in the sense that they are following people who are deliberately reporting themselves, so they would be placed inside the Broward Detention Center, a notorious camp that I didn't have any idea about, in order to track what's happening inside, to document what's happening inside, and find ways to get people released from inside, putting themselves right on the line. It was very brave work. So the walls that we saw up here, it's one wall that you see there, but in the Infiltrators, it's a lot of walls and closing them in. And it's just very moving, very powerful. And mixing both of the forms with narrative film with documentary in that way was just really beautifully done.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I'd like to add out there is there's this kind of emergent conversation around like basically art and social change, pop culture and social change, film and politics. There's this world of impact producing where you make a film and then raise money for it to go out and impact the conversation on global warming or impact the conversation on police brutality. And I think it's exciting that these spaces are emerging, that the funding apparatuses are emerging to do this. But I also personally in my life experience it much more as a circle in terms of like, and I think maybe you might have seen this in the farm worker context where the activism itself, the street activism, people, the subjects of the violence, the subject of the situation rising up and starting to organize creates a kind of theater or creates a kind of art in and of itself that then a sort of trained artist or a practicing artist can kind of come in and listen to and learn from and synthesize and make a work that then has an impact, hopefully, in the conversation broadly. But it's, sometimes people talk about how will and grace led to gay marriage and stuff like that. But it's also ACT UP probably informed the people who, and empowered and made the people who wrote Will and Grace, So there's a circle between activism and creativity, a circular mode or a circular formation that I think we've tried to really, with this film, live inside. But I don't know if you see that historically in these other movements that you've been part of.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that I learned from making Dolores and reflected upon in watching your film is that oftentimes the people in the struggle, they get disillusioned. People get killed, people get beaten, people get deported, and they feel defeated. And oftentimes, as an activist struggling for change, you lose more than you win. And so when people were down, Luis Valdez went to his camp at night and he typed an acto, a one-act play, pulled the pickup truck the next day into the fields and enrolled some farm workers to put on some costumes, and they performed this comedy, and it lifted the spirit of the people in struggle. Mm-hmm. And same thing in the Black Civil Rights Movement, they would use music. And it's the same thing in the struggle in South Africa, the labor movement in the United States. They used art as a way to lift the spirit of the people. And then at the same time, it would escape the community itself, and it would broaden the conversation. So it's kind of sort of this dual role. And I see, you see that happening and emerging in your film as well. But can you speak to that a little bit about how, as an artist, art against the wall, it's serving that dual purpose of when dreamers see this or undocumented people in the struggle see this film, they're going to be inspired. At the same time, we're sharing and broadening the conversation and bringing other people into it.
Mm-hmm. I think
Sure. I think so. So yeah, we tried. Cristina and I have had sort of different careers and different impulses. For me, I've always been interested in pop. Like with even the film about my dad and the potato, I tried to use this language that was very sort of light, even though it's talking about issues like assimilation and alienation and being uprooted. But vis-a-vis the potato, it can also be fun and oddball and kind of invite in an audience. In this film, we're using, in The Infiltrators, we're using the language of basically a heist. It's like we're going to break into a detention center to get somebody out. And so we called it kind of the Ocean's 11 of immigration. And
Ocean's 11.
Yeah, Ocean's 11. And so it's like, that's been... It's interesting because for me, one of the reasons is to broaden the conversation. If you present it as a genre film with the title The Infiltrators, people lean forward, what is that? And they end up hopefully trapped in a story in which an undocumented person is the hero, and where the mission is to stop deportations. And have you ever seen that before? And so hopefully that helps in this sort of process of translation and amplification, taking the story outside. But then, of course, we also hope that it's like a historical document. Our history, immigrant history, Latino history, is not told enough, barely at all. And this event, that the true story that we depict in the film, is epic. It's incredible. It should be well known. The nation should know it. And so, you know, an undocumented youth themselves, the new generation, don't know it. And so it actually needs to be memorialized and reiterated, regurgitated. And there's something, I think, good and powerful in that. Yeah, and so it's like sort of thinking on those multiple registers of, you know, preservation of a history, a story internal to a community being retold and activated, and then trying to use whatever, you know, discursive tools, whatever tools we have as filmmakers, to make it also accessible and broad and invite people in, and you know, and I think that can happen.
I just got a little stuck on the question because I was thinking about like the intent is to inspire people in the movement or undocumented people, and I was having a hard time with that because I was thinking, well, but it's like all of us, you know, like I want it to be for all, and I guess if I think about how I was thinking about how this film could create change is I'm so used to seeing the immigrant in this role of a victim, you know, and just powerless. And one of the exciting things about making this film is that they are young people, not always nice, you know, and like, you know, they're multidimensional human beings, you know, that laugh and all are dealing with really difficult situations that are life and death sometimes, but they're also young, you know, and they're just trying to get by. And the combination of that made it feel like just such a, fertile, like a different kind of border, you know, that we haven't really seen. But yeah.
I'm going to reference the Marthas, your documentary, Cristina, because in that one, the immigrant population has a different way of coping. They become the other. Right. They take over the tropes that that white America brought there, and assume them. They're celebrating George Washington's birthday with these huge gowns and these coming out debutante balls, and are incredible and utterly theatrical. And they're all playing the role playing. They're playing Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Martha Washington, all these folks that are appearing there, and most of them are people of Mexican descent, people that George Washington probably never laid eyes on. Mm-hmm. And it's how they are saying, look, this is how we're American. This you can't touch us. Mm-hmm. And it was adopted early on in the history of the celebration of these parties of George Washington, his birthday, so that they wouldn't be targeted or deported or chased away. I thought that was remarkable, and it's their kind of theater. It's spectacular. Yeah.
Thank you for referencing that. Yeah, it's almost like Gabriel Garcia's Macondo, you know, it's like a very playful border. Yeah.
Survival strategy, many different strategies for surviving and mitigating. I think Las Martas is a film, sort of like the Infiltrators, you show up for the heist and then you end up in this political story. In Las Martas, you show up for the gown, and it's like this wild spectacle of sparkling wonder. And
it's
surreal.
Surreal,
but then it turns out it's a survival strategy. Yeah. Underneath the gown is actually a deep history. You know, so that the film is wonderful.
I think I have time for one more before we go to Q&A. Okay. As storytellers, as a playwright, you know, as a playwright, as a filmmaker, one of the things I was reflecting on in watching your film was how when the Western Hemisphere was first colonized and we killed and appropriated native land. And in order to do that, we had to dehumanize. You know, there were, I think it was the first 88 years of colonization, Native people weren't even regarded as human beings. And same thing with Africans. We had to dehumanize in order to allow that institution to flourish. And in the same way, we see, we have to dehumanize the people in struggle coming across the border. And one of the remarkable powers of story is it humanizes. And I was really struck in your film by the young woman who infiltrates. She goes into Brouwer, and she's afraid, but she connects with all the other detainees, and she says, I see my family in their struggle, in their families. And in the same way, when I read Retablos, I felt I saw my own life in this little boy's struggle, not just with dealing with the politics and the dynamics around the border, but just in being a little boy coming of age, figuring out sex and toys and movies and who I was and where I belong. It just puts a human face on it, and I'd love for the three of you to address, as more and more Latinos, African Americans, as we get these platforms to express our voices and tell our stories, and in many ways like deconstruct the myths that a lot of us grew up with. We're humanizing and bringing people into the conversation, and I think it's such a great counter. As Octavio walked in, he says, have you seen the headlines today, the latest Trump headline about the border and about how our people are being framed? Can you speak to the power of story to humanize?
Well, I think as far as I'm concerned, with both Mother Road at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and what I was trying to do with this book, is to create empathy. I think there's a dearth of empathy in the world, and we start to see things from one point of view and not from the other. And what I'm trying to do is just hold a mirror up to reality and make us all see ourselves, and then see other people and see why they are this way, and why we are this way, and why we're regarded this way. But that means really seeing ourselves in their shoes, really placing ourselves in their situation and trying to understand. That can't happen until we open ourselves up, until we start to create real empathy. And then you start to understand why people are afraid. There's also, for me also, it's about, I think a lot of the fear is around the question of who are the heirs to the American dream? Who are the ones who are really now taking on that mantle and really starting to reflect the values of this thing called the American dream? And I see it in the dreamers, in the ones, in the people that were in the Infiltrators. I went, wow, they're really, those are the soldiers that are protecting the American dream, and yet they're the ones that are being denied it. And I think that's what people are afraid of, is that, are they going to be the new Americans now? Is this the new America? Why should they be afraid of that?
And I think that's this question of empathy and rehumanizing, the opposite of dehumanizing, and art. I mean, I think there's so many cross currents and so many different ways to do that work. And I think through literary work, through history, all of that is part of this process of rehumanizing and trying to just acknowledge the reality and all of its complexity and depth that surrounds us. For me, with this film, again, and the question of pop, I mean, I think of pop, like pop cinema. We mentioned Ocean's 11, what's his name? Is it Danny Ocean? Or what's Clooney's character? Yeah, is it totally, like on paper, a completely unsympathetic person? He's a liar, a scoundrel, a thief, but because of the language of the cinema, we identify with him and we go on the ride and we root for him. And, so our culture is all about the rule of law, but in our pop culture, we celebrate the rogue, we celebrate the outsider, we celebrate the underdog, the person who stands up for a moral value even as they break laws. I mean, so there's all these complex and contradicted figures that are beloved in our society. And so with the Infiltrators, we're trying to use a little bit some of that cinematic energy and that cinematic vocabulary that can make you love someone like Danny Ocean and say, well, can we love an undocumented protagonist that way? Someone who's fighting that system, someone who is in this, on paper, this kind of legal gray zone, but morally is fighting the good fight. And so it's trying to find, in this case, different sort of thrusters inside of the culture. I was always fascinated by Luke Skywalker, and as an adult, when I got interested in immigration, and remembering as a child how much I loved Luke Skywalker, and thinking, hey, wait a second, he was smuggled himself in the trunk of a spaceship across these space borders, and he's like biblical in our society, so beloved. But the people who are actually getting in the trunk of a car to get across a border to pursue their dreams are, what part of illegal don't you understand, you filthy animal, and can we, as creators and storytellers, can we switch the fuses, go in like, take the ticking bomb apart and cross the wires and say, can we use the thrust in pop culture of love for the underdog, of love for the rebel, and help create, like, in that space, a little bit of a moment of possibility to think about immigrants and border crossers, border transgressors in a different way.
That's great. Yeah, and when I was first starting to make films, you would see someone who would make a film about a person of color, Latinos, and that's what I was mostly paying attention to. And if the person was not from the community, they were seen as somebody who was really risky and artistic. But if you saw a film from somebody who was from that community, that film was judged so harshly. Like, is it, are you being objective? Is this true? Maybe you can't see right straight, But I think that's not so common anymore. But I feel like that's still a challenge that we have today in some ways. So in thinking about storytelling as a way to create empathy, I think you also need to think about who that person is that's telling that story, because the more specific. Just another thing I've learned is from my filmmaking experiments is that the more specific I was able to get on who the person was that was the protagonist to my own life or to what I knew, the more it translated to another audience, because we can all connect to having our period, women having your period, or awaken love, coming of age. We all have these. So I don't want to be a journalist, I want to be a storyteller and do it through protagonists that are very specific to who I know, because I know that you'll get that, you'll relate, like not you, like the world,
That's great. Before we go to the Q&A, I have to say this, since this is an independent film festival, I watched Alex and Christina's films, to the wee hours of the morning. And I was absolutely blown away by Infiltrators, and I have to say that what's it, Spider-Man Enter the Spider-Verse, they expanded the genre, they expanded the language of animation just by putting this Afro Latino kid in this film, listening to hip hop, living in New York City, speaking Spanish with no subtitles with his mother, in a similar way that Ryan Coogler did with Black Panther. He made a superhero movie that posed the question, what would have happened to Africans had they not been colonized, and addressed issues of identity and Black power and Black beauty in a completely familiar genre like Luke Skywalker. Mm-hmm. And in that expanded the visual language and also the genre in and of itself, and it caused shockwaves, within the industry, and everybody's paying attention to these. And I was watching Infiltrators, and I just have to say to all the cinemaphiles that I think Alex and Cristina have expanded the genre and the visual language. I've never seen a film combine documentary and reenactment and drama in a way like this before, and I feel like it's going to send reverberations. It expanded my cinematic vocabulary. Like, oh my God, this is possible. But just in terms of aside from the activism and the storytelling and how it's so just cinematically, it's a brilliant piece of work, and I really encourage all of you to go see it.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. Well done.
That's so cool. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
So,
Thank you, brother.
we have time for questions. If anybody, you want the mic for questions, or yeah, and I'll be able to move around too. Anybody?
This
Yes.
lady has her hand.
This is a general question. I was wondering, when you conceive an idea like this, how do you know whether it would work better as a play versus a film?
I guess that must be for me. Well, I was raised in the theater from an early age, so I've always used the vocabulary of the theater. That's my bailiwick. But lately, I've had some stories that just had to be expressed in a different way. They felt like they weren't really theatrical, so that's why I went to fiction. I think that there's a lot. There's ways in which they can translate into cinema, but you use a very different vocabulary. The poetic language that I use in my plays might not be really working in that. Like I have Mother Road right now, and I have a chorus, and the chorus actually describes what they're driving past as they're driving in a car where the 2 or 3 main characters are driving. The chorus is describing what they're seeing. Well, in a film, you can't really have a chorus saying that. You just show it. You show that. You create that the poetry visually, and so the language has to go away. It becomes descriptions for the cameraman, for the cinematographer. So that's one of the ways in which that would work. But I chiefly, because I love poetic language and that's sort of my pedigree, that's where I leaned into theater more than in other forms. I don't know if that's helpful.
Back here.
Do you feel that it is the human condition to create the other and to create borders, and that it's the role of art to change that narrative? Or do you think that the borders are created by those in power, and it's the role of art to fight that power with opening our heart?
That's deep. That's like an Alex question.
That's
definitely
very
an Alex
esoteric,
question.
man. Who wants to handle that?
That's a good. I mean,
Thank you for that.
Thank you for that. And
Yeah.
my brain is melting a little bit here. I mean, the human condition and human nature. These are things that I personally feel incapable of accessing. I don't know who my daughter is by nature versus by society. How to take it apart and find her nature, as opposed to what she got from Netflix. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know. We're all melted together. But I do think, if we, if we look at borders in terms of who draws them, moments in history when they're drawn, the conditions in which they're drawn, moments in time in which they're enforced, who's benefiting broadly. I think the analysis that I would have is that the border that we've built on the southern edge of this country has served not to stop hardly anybody from crossing. It's served as a kind of very effective way to trap workers inside this country, actually. People who we need to remember, like when Cristina and I filmed that, the wall then was about 6 years old. The wall started to go up under President Clinton, Operation Gatekeeper, the mid-1990s. But for the 150 years before that, there was no wall at all. People would sort of go around, circular migration, come and work and return. And the wall has been effective at trapping people here. It's been effective at terrorizing working class people broadly. It's been effective at creating a working class that is sort of in a situation where their amount of rights and that they have are limited. And so it's, I just view it as a sort of one of many different attacks historically on the people who do the most essential work in our society. If you look historically, there's all the people who produce food, who care for children, who produce clothing. The people who reproduce life historically are the ones who are slaves, deportable, disposable, shut out of being able to organize a union, etc. So I view it as one apparatus in that toolbox. That's how I view it, and that it should be challenged through that kind of language. It should be challenged morally and holistically. It's my.
I'm just gonna. It's such a provocative question to me because you're asking me to think about. I know it wasn't the direct question, but like I'm now thinking about like the function of otherness, and is there a function to that? Is there a good reason to do that? And I can see how that could be a therapeutic experiment to kind of get over trauma and but to create some sort of protection. And I can see it being weaponized, right, as we're seeing it today, as this way of creating a military violence against someone. You have to dehumanize that person and make them an other so that you can do that job of being a military organizing them in a military way. So, I mean, it's a great question. I think right now we're so used to otherness as being divisive, and so the role of art is obvious for me. Definitely a way of getting through that problem and trying to see how we are the same and connecting people. I don't know. I love what you're thinking about. I think.
My question kind of follows what you're saying, and that is that I agree with you that the future depends on art, and your way of changing the world is through art. My problem is that our country now is so divided, and my fear is that you're preaching to the choir. So I wonder what your plan is to talk to the other side.
Mm-hmm. I'll just throw a real quick answer in here. It's related to what Alex was talking about when he was talking about the heist movie. Like when we were first organizing the film as a narrative, we were thinking, how can someone who doesn't care about immigration watch this? We want to make it entertaining at the same time, like sneak in these messages. I mean, we didn't quite sneak them in; they're pretty obvious. But I think we were somewhat successful with the heist genre. But yeah.
Completely.
And then, what was I going to say? But people use the phrase preaching to the choir like to denigrate, but preachers preach to the choir because that's a good thing to do. It's a useful thing to do. It's emerged historically as a useful thing to do, to gather on Sunday and to talk. And it might be the same people every Sunday, but it's still good to get together and talk. And I think in the case of immigration, like if we're like in a kind of blue pocket or a blue state or whatever, Democrats and blue people, Smurfs, don't know what we're doing about immigration. There is actually not much vision. There's not much consensus. What you're getting out of a Nancy Pelosi type figure to say, well, are you for open borders? No, we're not for open borders. We're for smart borders and smart security. And they just passed a giant spending bill with drones and all kinds of crazy technology on the border. And that's kind of what they've been about, while Trump is about like a big cement wall. So you've got like medieval border security versus like postmodern border security. And that's the debate in our country. And we need to talk to our choir. People who, if you're going to start from a place of like a moral, where do you start in this conversation? And to me, it has to be a moral place. And my moral beginning point is that that we're, basically my family that I know, we're all kind of just as good. We're all people. We're all morally deserving, brothers and sisters, under whether you think God or nature or whatever, but I start with that. And if I think then that they have a right to move as much as me, they're not a cattle, they don't deserve to be behind a fence and told, you stay here because you were born there, because you lost the birth lottery, so you stay put. So if I start with that kind of a framework, a moral framework of equality and of freedom, then I end up at a very challenging place in terms of border security. Because then to enforce a border, you do need to detain people. You need to stop, you need to have certain people who can cross, certain people who can't. You end up with detention camps. You end up with deportations. I find that all of it personally, morally repugnant. It doesn't make moral sense to me. If I was born in Haiti and I wanted to move, I would want my brothers and sisters on this planet to say, you deserve to be able to be where you feel free and good. That's, but we don't have a framework to think about freedom of movement. nowhere in this society. It's a conversation that has not started yet. So that's why preaching to the choir, to me, is super important. I want to hear what other people who think immigrants are human beings that are worthy of dignity, what do you guys think? How should this phenomenon be thought through and managed? I personally don't think anyone should be put in a cage for moving. But what does that mean politically, socially? How does that, it's a big set of questions. And so I think the choir, we need to have a lot of preaching and a lot of listening and cookies after church and kind of, so here we are.
Yeah. I say tell more stories with brown people in them. Just tell more stories with brown people in them. I worked on Coco, and think of all the people in this country that saw that film and wept when Miguel sang to his abuela, to Abuela Coco at the end. And how much they have come just a little further in empathizing and relating to the Latino experience through that film. And that was seen by millions of people around the world, and especially in this country. It's made a huge difference. And it's only been out a year and a half. I was the honored ranger at my high school for homecoming, and so I went to Riverside High School in El Paso, and it's called Riverside High School because it's right by the Rio Grande. And the theme for homecoming was Coco, and it was Coco everything. And I don't think people at Pixar or at Disney realize how deeply embedded and important that film has become to the culture, and how it's spreading now, so that it's not simply for the Mexican American community, but for everyone. And that's one way in which we're making some inroads in those communities that feel like, we gotta protect our borders. We have to watch out with these people. We're making some headway in that, through story. Just tell more of those stories. Get them out there. Through film, through theater, through books, any possible way.
The Coco virtual reality is amazing.
To follow up on that, first I just want to thank all four of you for the amazing stories that you've brought forward. It is incredible to note the stark contrast between what you're bringing forward and what just occurred here in Ashland over the past week, which was the 50th celebration of the sister city, Ashland to Guanajuato, Mexico.
Oh, wow.
And we have, for those of you that are tourists, we had over 45 people here from Guanajuato participating in that celebration, which is a celebration of essentially two families, two cultures, the Mugo Club, over 1,000 exchange students between Southern Oregon University and the University of Guanajuato, over 80 marriages between the two, and utilizing art. The mural downtown, which I would invite you to see, which was voted the most popular piece of public art in Ashland, 50-foot mural of Guanajuato, painted by a Guanajuato artist, and was the subject to a film which is on the subject you're talking about, The Walls We Create by Nisha Burton, which was shown 2 years ago in the film festival here, contrasting that walls can separate and walls can bring people together. There's currently, as of last year, a new mural in Guanajuato of Ashland, painted by an Ashland artist. And all part of that celebration of the diversity in culture, as opposed to we all have to be the same. So I really appreciate your bringing forward this frightening contrast.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to mention, too, that the border is not just a physical wall. Border is also aligned with language and identity. And one of the things that's really powerful in the Infiltrators are, you see these young people addressing the names that have been put on them: illegal alien, illegals, wetbacks, mojados, foreigners. One of my son's little friends at Talent Elementary, his mom called me up. He's a brown-skinned boy. And some kids at the school told him, you're ruining our country. Go back to the other side of the wall where you came from. He's born here. And so it's really, really important to also see the language that goes hand in hand with the border. A few months ago, there was a Mixtec girl and a Mayan little boy who died. They're full-blooded Native American. And what we tend to forget when we use these terms like illegal alien or wetback or foreigner, we forget that this brown that you see right here and that you see on my brother here and my sister, that came from somewhere. It didn't come over on the Mayflower on the boat. That color, that culture, that bloodline is indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. And so if you erase with these labels, if you erase identity, then you also erase the memory that we once owned the land. We belonged to the land. And the people who came who were also immigrants, like Dolores Huerta always says, if you're not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, you came from someplace else. And the idea that migration it's a human phenomena. It's not just human. I mean, the monarch butterfly does it. All species do it. But to remember those labels when we come to these conversations that go with the border, and that a lot of if you look at the caravans that are coming from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Mexico, even further south, a lot of times, I'm blown away by, look at these full-blooded Indian people. They are from here. Their forebears have been here for millennia. There's a great book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It's called The Indigenous Peoples' History of America. The first chapter is called Follow the Corn. And it talks about how corn as a centralizing cultural apparatus that went north and south from Central America, and really with it brought civilization to the indigenous world. And it's really, if you look at the stronghold is Mexico and Central America, where a lot of those things. And so these are all things to be aware of when we're talking about foreigners and labels and illegal aliens, and let's build this wall, and I think we need to re-examine. I have one friend. She won't even. She's an immigrant. She's undocumented, and she gets pissed off if she will not use the word alien. She says, that's not my language. Mm-hmm. That's an apparatus, and I refuse, to wear that.
Mm-hmm. Just quickly, I think it's very interesting that when we talk about the border, we automatically mentally go south. But we have a northern border. Mm-hmm. And the differences between the way we view our northern border with Canada and our southern border, I think it deserves some discussion, because it is based on that otherness. We don't have the same kind of otherness with Canadians, but we do. I mean, we are different cultures. We speak similar languages. That is a big deal. But anyway, if you would address that, because surely it comes into your view of all of this.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I think it ties in with what Peter was saying, is that you not only share the same language with Canadians, but white people look like white Canadians. They look the same. Whereas people from Mexico, they look dark, they look Indian, they look native, because they are, because that's their heritage, and I think that's at the root of it. I think it's racism, and we have to also remember that we're not the only ones that are capable of political theater. I went home to El Paso recently to see my folks, and I have an MFA. I have 7 years of college behind me. I was born in this country. I've had plays done in major American theaters, and I was very proud to have that. And under my belt, I went to see my parents, and I'm I consider myself like an achievement. I've done stuff in this in this society. I am somebody.
Yes, you
but
have.
But when I was leaving, I went to El Paso International Airport, went through TSA, and as I was going to my terminal, there's a little station there for the Border Patrol, and they're looking out. And with all the people that are going through, they picked me to come over, and they questioned me and asked me to see my proof of citizenship, opened my bag, asked me how long I've been in this country, asked me if I'm from Mexico, what am I bringing in, and they questioned me. So, and I said, I kept telling them, they're doing their job, they have to do this, they're doing their job. But they let other people go, and they made an example of me. They did their own theater performance, trying to show, not just me to knock me down a peg and make me, remind me that, hey, you're just, in the end, another Mexican. But they were making a performance so that everyone else could see, look, you can look as middle class as you want, but you are still subject to search and seizure. You're still subject to be questioned in this way. And so I felt, again, like that little boy in the red tee. It's like they won't let that go. They will always remind me of that. So they're as much capable of political theater as we are.
And it's real quick in terms of like immigration law and race broadly. It's a long story, but the people probably know the first immigration law in this country was Chinese exclusion, right? That was the very first law that sought to regulate the movement of any group of people in and out of this country. And from that moment going forward, it's basically been the kind of through line in immigration law. It's been a kind of racial gerrymandering of the nation. And if you want like a book, Impossible Subjects by May Nye is a really amazing book that looks at basically the invention of the alien in the early 1900s, sort of after Chinese exclusion and going forward. But the book is incredible, and the history is not ambiguous. It's actually very, very clear that the purpose of these immigration controls was to sort of freeze demographically the country when it was, a hyper majority European, and all the immigration control system has been trying to figure out how to let European migration continue while putting the brakes on all these dark-skinned folks. But Impossible Subjects is an amazing read. And
We have one last question.
Does anybody remember a movie that came out a while ago? Is this better? A while ago called A Day Without a Mexican. Someone needs to remake that.
Yeah.
Because the story is the
Re-release
same.
it anyway.
Yes, but it was kind of cheesy.
it was a little cheesy.
But I mean, the demographics have seriously changed since that movie was made. So it would be like an empty country, A Day Without a Mexican, or A Day Without an Immigrant.
Right.
No,
that's good.
it keeps coming up when I think of this conversation.
That's Sergio Arau is a filmmaker.
Well, I want to thank all of you, Cristina, Alex, Octavio, and Peter. It's a wonderful panel.
Thank you. Thank you.